let's
It's on the
see.
bottom. If you hover on the bottom of your screen, you'll get mute video, participants, share screen. There should be a Q&A icon.
Let's see. If I'm hovering on the screen. Oh, here it is, Q&A. Yes. So I just opened that window. Okay. All right, sounds good. And then let's see if we do a shared screen. So is that showing up?
Yeah, it shows up in the big part, and then we're still smaller on the side here.
Okay.
If we go to speaker view, then it's just you. If we go to gallery view, then both of us show up.
Okay.
So now there's 22 here, so maybe wait a few more minutes to see they'll show up.
Okay.
Some people wrote that they can't attend now, but they want to watch later. So it'll be saved on Facebook and YouTube, so they can watch later.
Okay. Here we've got another guest.
Swami Dharma is here. I tried to make him a panelist, but the cat is sheltering in place too?
Yes, it's a new addition. He was in a cage a week ago, so he's a saved cat.
Ah.
Hello.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Also at the farm as well. So, yeah.
Nice. So one advantage of having the lives you guys lead is in the current times,
doesn't change much.
Doesn't change much. It's like, okay.
It's kind of the same. Yeah.
Yeah. A life of retreats rolling one into the other.
Yeah. So good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I thought I would go through kind of the basic skill sets, and then as people have questions, they can type in their questions either in the Q&A or the chat box, and then we can and then take Q&A at the end also.
Yeah, that'll be good. Okay.
So now we're at 25. I think we had 96 registered, Swami Dharma. So I'm not sure if we should wait a few more minutes.
Is it okay with you, Shani, just to wait a couple more minutes?
Sure. It's like, no, that would be too stressful.
Yeah.
How are you guys doing with the sheltering with folks?
We're doing well. You know, we keep our regular practice going and limiting, of course, going out as little as possible. So, but all in all, it's good. As Swami Sita she gave a talk on turning inward in the COVID-19. So that's what we're doing. How are you guys? You've been at home for a few weeks, or?
Yeah. So all universities, all colleges are all online now. And yeah. So I've taught hybrid classes before, but I prefer in person but there are some folks that probably half of colleges and university classes have already been transitioning to online over the last decade. So there's a lot of folks that have been teaching online that this is seamless to them. I've mostly taught in person. So there was a bit of an adjustment, but yeah, using Zoom primarily to teach. Some folks are teaching online using Canvas, so that's asynchronous. So if you want to teach in real time, Zoom is the obvious thing to do. Canvas also is so that's the program most universities are using, and it does have a synchronous component, but it's not often used, whereas Zoom is explicitly synchronous. So that seems to be the program of choice.
Okay, yeah. So you're busy.
Yeah, so it's a lot. It actually seems to take more energy for some reason. There's less of kind of an exchange of energy in person, I think. So it's more of an output. It's a little hard to, it's doable, but it's a little harder to go back and forth as much. And so, but it's good. It's amazing that technology allows us to do this.
Yeah.
So this would have been very different if it was 20 years ago.
We would have been writing letters to each other.
Right. So this Q&A would have taken about 6 months.
Yeah.
And yet there's something kind of quaint about that. That's also a good practice.
All right. I think maybe we can just start because it's 1:10 already.
Okay. So Shani, I'll just introduce you real quick to everybody.
Sure.
Is everyone on now, Swami?
Yeah, I think you can go ahead.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. And today we're happy to welcome Dr. Shani Robbins, who's a psychologist and teaches at Stanford University and at Foothill College. He's also the founder of the Wisdom Therapy Institute, and he's teaching here with us at the Yoga Farm for Yoga Health Educator training as well. So we're very happy to have you, Shani, and talk about stress in this very challenging time. So welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. It's good to virtually meet all of you. I'm sorry we can't be doing this in person, but also grateful for the fact that we can do this remotely, and so it doesn't necessarily have to wait, which is one of the messages in these times, right? To adapt and to still be grateful for the freedom to be able to focus what we can do rather than what we can't. And so that's going to be one of the messages. But overall, what I wanted to do today is go over a set of skill sets that in psychological science have proven to be very successful in dealing with stress. And then adding to those kind of more cutting edge psychology in the field of so-called positive psychology. And so, and integrating that with some skill sets that you guys are already practicing quite a bit. So like mindfulness, empathy, compassion, gratitude. And so integrating the two together. So I'll go through that, take about an hour or so, and then leave some time at the end, maybe 10, 15 minutes for questions. If there are any questions along the way, kind of burning questions in terms of definitions or anything that's not clear, feel free to type those into the Q&A box or the chat box. And then if I'm not seeing those for whatever reason, one of your leaders can point it out to me, and so feel free to stop me with any of those questions. If you feel like it can wait till the end, then you can hold off to the end for it. So it's I'll leave it to you. And so just even as we start now, let me pop this up in PowerPoint in viewer mode. Let's see. So even as we're going through that, one of the distinctions we want to first make is Western and Eastern approaches to mental health. So when we talk about stress, anxiety, frustration, anger, in the Western psychological science, it's mostly been about a healthy self, a healthy ego. And so experiencing less anxiety, stress, anger, skill sets around that. And then for millennia, for a few thousand years, Eastern traditions been about transitioning, ego transcendence. And so One line is a healthy self, the other is transcending self. And so part of what we're talking about today, what I've come to call wisdom therapy, is the integration of the two. So I want to point out skill sets that for contributing to both in terms of what we consider mental health. Here's a kind of a list of the skill sets we're talking about. So just realism, things like thought patterns that tend to be realistic versus less so. Mindfulness, being present. We know anxiety loves the future, so if we can stay present, that alone reduces anxiety. Emotional intelligence, as anxiety and stress start coming up, or frustration and irritation, can we catch it at this level before it gets to here? So emotional intelligence is partially defined in how are we aware of our emotions? How quickly can we be aware of our emotions? And can we regulate our emotions? And what skills can we bring in to regulate those? And so the other skill sets we're talking about, so whether it's mindfulness or yoga or combinations of different skill sets, what are we doing to be able to regulate that? And so that's part of the theme, empathy and compassion for others. So that while we're cultivating a healthy self-care, we're balancing that with a balance of caring for others. And so I'll keep bringing this back to the theme of in the current era. Obviously the elephant in the room here is the coronavirus and self-sheltering. And so why self-shelter? And so there's a balance here in terms of self-care. So taking care of ourselves so we're not infected. So that's part of it. But of course, the high proportion of folks, something like 98% of the population, even if they do get it, eventually will likely just experience it as a flu, some mild, some serious, but flu, and then get over it. It's that 2% that are at high risk that are really going to be the ones that we want to be able to take care of and to hold off infecting them, because that 2% are going to be experiencing much more than just a flu, and it's life-threatening. And so if we flatten the curve and reduce the rate of exposures, then it gives the medical profession and the government several more months to come up with the respirators and these other things, so fewer people need to be really sick and fewer people need to die. And so out of pure empathy and compassion for those at highest risk, it makes sense to shelter for that reason as well. So ideally, so notice there are these three categories: sheltering out of fear for self. That's probably the less skillful category. Sheltering out of prudence and self-care. That is the more skillful category for self. And then sheltering out of compassion and empathy for others. And so if we can, out of these two, balance those out in both self-care and compassion for others. So there's that. Humility, we'll talk about that and define it. Gratitude practice. So even in the worst of times, when things are difficult, there's still a lot to be grateful for. So it's a good reminder and to make that a explicit practice. And then ego transcendence, beyond ourselves, and so that, which is part of empathy and compassion. We'll talk about that. So these are the skill sets I'm going to be highlighting, some more than others. Again, just to give you a lay of the land of what are the skills to be practiced. As we go through this, by the way, I want to point out that kind of the overarching theme here is using this as an opportunity to practice, just like we would use anything as an opportunity to practice. Even prior to the coronavirus situation, right, there were plenty of anxiety and stressors in our life. Anything from as mundane as traffic or standing at a Starbucks line or having an argument with someone. There's a difference between just kind of trying to white knuckle your way through that and just bear it and get over it, versus embracing every opportunity, every experience, every conflict, everything that's perceived as conflict, whether it's mundane or not. And if life is already bringing conflict to us, why not use it as opportunity for growth? It's already here, let's use it. And so this coronavirus situation is not immune from that, no pun intended. It's the next thing life has brought us to use for practice. And so seeing it as that alone helps reduce some of the frustration and the stress. And so as we get into the discussion of stress, it's worth defining what stress even is. And so as we're doing that, we can help define stress as the resources that are perceived, the perceived demands of the world over the perceived resources. And the reason we're saying perceived demands is and perceived resources is that there's some subjectiveness to that. So for example,
sorry to interrupt.
Oh,
Someone is already asking in the chat if you can go back one screen. I guess they wanted to see something on the previous screen.
sure.
Elena is asking. I think it might have been one more from that because you were on this screen. Okay.
So
Elena, hopefully that's what you're looking for. Okay. She said yes. That's it.
okay. And what is the question? Feel free to ask.
Yeah, if you want to type a question, Elena, you can go, or you just want to see that screen. I'm not sure. Western versus Eastern. Maybe no question.
Okay. All right. And again, if any questions come up later on, feel free. So yeah, and the screen was not meant to necessarily pin this down as the only way of looking at this, but just to give a broad framework that their differences in approaches have been broadly wide. And so that's there is this collectivist culture difference from an individualist culture difference. And and now there's considerable evidence that if we want to facilitate wellness and health, it makes sense probably to do both. And there's now abundant evidence you can do both simultaneously. So that was the main idea of this slide. All right, so now as we go through it and identify part of what we're trying to do, reducing stress, is even though this is the focus, we're reminding that stress is almost an excuse to do developmental work here, using it as opportunity to practice. So those three magic words, opportunity to practice. And the idea is that if we're living a developmentally oriented life, and again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this would be preaching to the choir for most of you. In some contexts where it's more traditional context, and that becomes the part of the focus. But here, the fact that you all self-selected yourself into these practices and into yoga and so on, that you've already, I'm highlighting something you've already basically made a choice in your life, is to live a developmentally oriented life. So I'm highlighting that it's not to exclude anything from that practice. And so the notion, once we live a so-called developmentally oriented life, the reminder is using every opportunity to practice. And so seeing it in that frame, whether it's stress or anger or frustration, whatever the emotion is, it's included in that general framework. And so let's quickly define what we're talking about just at another level when we talk about stress. What's happening to our body, for example, and neurologically is our brain has these two systems, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system is fight flight. So something happens, we don't have the resources to deal with it. It's built into us as a kind of a genetic predisposition evolutionarily to either run or fight. That seems to be one of the defaults. I should mention, just because something is a genetic predisposition doesn't mean it's determined. It just means there's momentum in that direction. Everything is changeable. And so that's also the assumption here. So through the cultivation of skill sets and practice, everything is changeable, no matter what the genetic predisposition is for temperament or anger or depression or alcoholism or anything. And so in general psychological science, there's an acknowledgement that there are some genetic predispositions for some things. When we look at our relatives and ancestry, if there's more stress and anxiety and anger, then it is more likely that we have some more genetic predispositions for it. But first of all, we may not. It's just more likely. It doesn't mean it's so. But second, even if it is so, it doesn't mean it has to be activated. So even if I have an inclination towards anxiety, if I'm doing yoga and I'm meditating and I have emotional, and I'm practicing emotional intelligence and mindfulness and so on, the likelihood that that genetic predisposition will be manifested goes down dramatically. So what we're saying here is that there's parts of us that have a predisposition, but they have to meet stressors in the environment, and we have to interpret those things as stressors in order to get activation of stress or anger or some other things. So what we're doing here is identifying skill sets that we're cultivating. So when something in the environment meets our skill sets rather than our some of these predispositions, you don't see the manifestation of things like stress or anxiety. So things don't have that reality in and of themselves. And again, this is message that you guys are probably used to. So this is another way of looking at this, where the brainstem and early evolution, and as you go up the brain, you get later and later evolutionary processes. And so when we reframe something, like for example, when we're driving, and we nowadays there's not going to be that much traffic, but if we're standing in line, or let's say we're at home, right, and now we're at home with others sheltering, there's new issues that start emerging. Notice I was catching that, calling it a problem and shifting from problem to issues or opportunities to practice. Someone once said, there's no such thing as a problem, only a pause between ideas. And so we've been given this pause of sheltering. And what do we do with that when we sometimes are only used to being with someone for 20 minutes a day, in the morning and the evening, and now we're with them 24/7? That creates opportunities to get to know them better, to update what kind of relationship we want to have with them, and so on and so on. So using those opportunities. And so our prefrontal cortex is the part that we reason with, that we problem solve with, and so on. And so some of the skill sets were affecting that. Some of the skill sets, like when we take some deep diaphragmatic breaths when doing meditation or doing yoga, are influencing our physiology and our neurology, our brain. And so we're working at multiple levels here. In defining what anxiety even is, it's nice to break it down into cognitions, what we think, behaviors, what we actually do, and physiology, the body's activation, heart rate, blood pressure, and so on. And so as we're thinking along those lines, how do we affect each of those three? So if we want to affect our thoughts, in a few minutes, I'll talk about the so-called cognitive distortions, like all or nothing thinking, catastrophizing, shoulds, musts. And so that we can shift from that. Like there shouldn't be sheltering, or we shouldn't have to go through this, or the government should have been more prepared. So the shoulds, the must, the all or nothing, catastrophizing, we have some control over what we do with those thoughts. And those thoughts give rise often to emotions. Same thing with behaviors. Do we want to keep practicing the old behaviors of being upset or raising our voice or so on? Then that's contributing to the anxiety. And again, same thing with physiology. If our heart rate is used to going up, and blood pressure and muscle tension and so on, those become conditioned responses. And so we more easily get anxious and so on. So realistically, we want to reduce anxiety. We want to work on all three fronts. And some of these advanced skills we're talking about, these so-called wisdom skills like mindfulness, emotional intelligence, gratitude, and so on, are affecting all three of these components. So as we're going through this, we're defining what we just described. So what we actually say and do is behavior. Let me apologize for a second. There's a good video that's kind of fun in terms of how we think about things and things like communication. And I wanted to bring this to people's attention. And this is a fun video that kind of shows a demonstration that sometimes how we perceive something and what we say and do and how somebody else perceives something can be very different. In this case, it's a couple talking past each other. And as they're talking past each other, one of them is focused on what the practical solution is. The other one is focusing that's what he's focusing on. She's focusing on, does he care? Is he there for her? And so on. And so notice what the dialogue looks like when two people are, rather than pausing and empathically trying to become aware of each other's perspective, are simply bringing their own agenda to the communication, which in this case are two different agendas. So let's take a quick look of what that looks like, and especially when it's done with some humor here. So enjoy, and we'll talk in a second.
And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me most, that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
You have Are you sure? Because I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there.
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing.
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail.
See, you're
out.
not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just sometimes it's like there's this achy. I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
Sounds really.
Ow!
Come on. If you would just
Don't.
Try to see things my way. Do I have to keep on talking till I can go on? We can work it out.
All right. So it's what makes this medium a little tough is I can't hear whether people are laughing or not. But the idea there, of course, is that we can sometimes not quite understand where the other one's coming from. So particularly in these times of sheltering, when we're together quite a bit, 24/7 around these things, it makes sense to bring that awareness to ourselves. And then later on, when we talk about humility, that will accentuate that even more. So it's not only anxiety coming from some challenges around us, part of it is coming from what we're largely bringing to our interactions. And so there is a theme here that's going to be recurring, and that's it's not necessarily the external environment that's causing our anxiety. It's in large part our interpretation of that. It doesn't mean there isn't some added challenge by, for example, sheltering. And so not being able to easily go outside and so on, of course, contributes. But what we do with that is everything. So for example, if we were previously driving in traffic and we're driving a car and then we hit traffic, you could say, well, the traffic caused my stress and anxiety. But if our framing of it was, I now have 10 more minutes to listen to music or an audiobook or call my friend, then suddenly traffic is not only not causing anxiety, it's actually welcomed. So that's an example where our framing of it becomes critical, and including our framing of this coronavirus, where at the very least, what we can say to ourselves is, okay, here comes one more opportunity to practice multiple skill sets in life. And so that's a nice beginning on those things. All right, so what are some of the practices? Of course, taking deep breaths. Behaviorally, we can take a deep breath. Physiologically too, that makes sense. Going for a walk around the block, again, 6 feet away from others, but that still doesn't disable us from taking a walk outside in the sunshine around the block. Or if we're in an ashram, taking walks around the ashram. If we're at home, sheltered, taking walks around our house, around the block, is something we can do. And again, rather than focusing on what we can't do, we have the option of focusing on what we can. And so physiologically, what's happening during fight flight, again, heart rate, muscle tension, cortisol is being pumped through our system. And so we're feeling that anxiety. So we're breaking this down of what we can do about it and using the opportunity to practice. And even this cognitive framing, instead of calling it a problem, we can call it a challenge or an opportunity to practice. And that shifts it kind of from a wall of I'm having anxiety and there's nothing I can do about it, to what can I do to kind of scale that wall, even if, or maybe even acknowledge the wall is actually our creation. There may not even be a wall there. It's just, again, namely an opportunity to practice. And so the notion that we can reframe a situation, and there are certain types of thinking that tend to cause more anxiety than others, has been pioneered in the last 70 years in psychological science. It's been tens of thousands of studies. And so what I'm talking about today, and particularly in this part of it, cognitive behavioral therapy, Aaron Beck, rational emotive therapy by Albert Ellis, has been around since 1950s or so. So if you think about what might be the gold standard in psychological science, this is mostly it. There are a lot of other orientations that I'm a fan of, different components of different orientations, but this stuff just gets you a lot of bang for the buck in terms of when you become aware of the kinds of thoughts we're thinking. Examples like that jerk cut me off in a freeway leads to anger. If we think for a second, the person in the car might be on the way to the hospital, might be on the way to helping someone, suddenly we feel empathy, compassion. So we're noticing this exact same event, but we switched our thinking. That leads to a very different emotional reaction. So just that is a powerful awareness. It's a very empowering awareness that my anxiety is not in the outside world. It's not in the event itself. It's not in the insult from someone. It's not in traffic. It's not in the sheltering. It's in my perception of the sheltering, mostly. Again, on a practical level, I know if there's noise in the world, and if there's the fact that we're inhibited from moving in some ways, that contributes to it. So there's a practicality to that. But if you think of the majority of what contributes to the anxiety, our perception of that. And so as we're thinking along these lines, here's an example. For example, people see marriage as a journey, as a partnership, as a war, whether there's winners and losers, a journey we've come a long way, we're spinning our wheels, roller coaster rides, there are ups and downs, investment, I've given the best years of my life, two-way street, give and take. And Henry Kissinger famously said, no one will ever win the war of the sexes because there's too much fraternizing with the enemy. And so that's it's add some humor to it. It's a war metaphor. It's one of the several metaphors. And the point is we can choose each of these metaphors that we're choosing to bring to the situation. So overall, we're looking at this notion that how we think dramatically influences how we feel in everyday life, in the workplace, with family. And so different framings lead to different emotions. And so there's a fun joke about a kid drawing a picture of God, and a teacher comes by and says, "What are you drawing?" And little Johnny says, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the teacher sort of condescendingly says, "But nobody knows what God looks like." And little Johnny beams with pride and says, "They will now." And so there's this idea of that there could be different ways of looking at different aspects of this. In some ways, there's more self-centeredness. In some cases, it's more of empathy, compassion towards others. And presumably over time, the skill sets just continue to grow through not just childhood and adolescence, but hopefully through adulthood as well. Here's a fun cartoon a student just sent me. Is there life after death? Jump this fence and find out. So to bring humor to even the most challenging of issues, in this case, life and death, there's something to be said for that in ego transcendence. I want to use an example. Let's hold off on that. It's kind of in the spirit of bringing humor to things. So what kind of thoughts typically lead to anxiety and stress and some other things that we're not going to have as much time to talk about, like anger, depression, so on. These are the same skill sets that can be used for that, but we're focusing on anxiety today, and particularly the coronavirus situation and sheltering. So here are so-called cognitive distortions that contribute to a lot of anxiety and often anger, all or nothing thinking. So we say, you know, this is always happening. I can never leave my house. And if we say I can never leave my house now, that would create more drama and more extreme emotions than if we say I can't leave my house as much as I would like. That's a very different statement than I can never leave. And better yet, if we can switch the thinking from not just all or nothing, but from I can't leave my house to there's guidelines in place and it would actually be prudent not to leave my house because I want to flatten the contagious curve, and if nothing else, out of compassion for others. So it's, if we shift from I can't to actually have a strong preference not to, in order to contribute to flattening the curve, suddenly it becomes something that we can't do to something that we would like to contribute to. So that's a very different framing. Some other ones, overgeneralization, taking a few cases, saying, oh, here we go again. Life is always bringing me all these negative events and challenges. It's taking a few events and overgeneralizing it to all of life. Negative mental filter, focusing primarily on the negative, rather than some really positive things that are going on now in life. Like, for example, giving us some more time. The time we're not commuting is time we can use for other things now, to exercise and to meditate and to do yoga and to read and introspect and to join webinars like this. And so there's that, disqualifying the positive. So shooting down positive experiences, and again, primarily focusing on the negative. So it's kind of the yes, but response. It's like, you know, we do have more time now and we can still practice these skills and compassion. Yes, but I have to be worried about whether I'll catch this or whether I'll be giving it to somebody else. Or so rather than holding balance of both the challenges, not ignoring those, but also gratitude for things that are actually not just going well, but are wonderful in our life. The fact that we can see or walk or and so let me go through those, and then I want to come back to anxiety and talk about what it would be like to live with low anxiety and low fear. But just to get through these, mind reading is another one, knowing what somebody's thinking, we know what somebody's thinking. Fortune telling, so predicting what the future holds. And it's very difficult to tell, right? Coming back to this coronavirus situation, it could take a month or two, it could take 3 or 4 months, we really don't know. We can go by the expert opinion from epidemiology and so on. You know, when we hear Fauci getting interviewed and so on CNN, we see that it's likely going to last a few months. It's not going to be just a few weeks. And so that gives us a realistic scale, and realism is at the heart of a lot of these skill sets. What's the realistic version of these things in terms of what will likely unfold? And so making good predictions helps. But sometimes our predictions, as realistic as we are, won't come to fruition. And what do we do with those? And that takes us to the next piece, from fortune telling to catastrophizing. So if it does last many months, I've heard people say things like, well, that's going to be horrible. For the 2% that are at highest risk, they are at risk for life and death. And if we want to use the word horrible, you know, people dying on the order of hundreds of thousands and possibly even getting into the millions. If 2% die from this, and if 100 million people catch it, then 2 million people will likely die. That gets to the numbers of genocide. That's talk about, I mean, if anything is, want to use the word horrible, it's that. And even with that, and with our own risks, so this is probably a good time to talk about kind of the heavy questions of how do we want to hold even life and death and being ill. And so to address some of that, I want to describe one of the conversations I have with folks who, for example, have a fear of flying. So in addressing other types of fears like phobias. And in fear of flying, the typical approach is to identify these cognitive distortions around it. Shoulds and musts is another one, personalization, taking it personally, catastrophizing, fortune telling. And so as we're looking at these so-called cognitive distortions, we can ask ourselves, what's the risk of flying? And then once you do the math, you realize when you're sitting on a plane, even though it feels very anxiety provoking, and by the way, there's something called emotional reasoning. Let's see, down here, this one, the third one down, even because it feels threatening, it must be threatening. So that's the notion of emotional reasoning. So it's worth noting that just because I'm feeling anxious doesn't mean there's a threat in the world. So I'm choosing to connect those two, feeling anxiety to the fact that that's real, the threat is real. It may not be, I just feel anxiety towards it. So that's along the lines of a phobia. And just because I feel fear of flying or snakes or heights, or doesn't mean those fears are realistic. In this case, for 98% of the population, the fears are likely not that realistic for self, but they are realistic for the others, the other 2%. Those threats are very high to their life. But even with that, there's something to be said for that. And here it is. So there's one thing to have empathy and compassion for others who are at risk. And that's a nice exercise to practice these things from that vantage point. It's another to have fear towards self. And in the fear towards self, again, we want to be prudent and good judgment and sheltering, and why expose ourselves needlessly and wash our hands. And those are all very useful, good practices. At the same time, in addition to all that, we can bring in yet another existential skill set, and that is that going back to the, let's say, a flying phobia. So am I safe flying? Yes. Is it a cognitive distortion that it's unsafe? Yes. Now, now that I realize flying is pretty safe, let's go to the other dark corner of all this and say, what happens if the plane crashes? So someone might say, well, okay, I know it's pretty safe. I've identified the fortune telling, catastrophizing aspect of this, and so on and so on. But what if it does crash? That it'll be horrible. And that's interesting and worthwhile examining. Yeah, let's say the plane does crash, and so if it does, life will end as we know it, possibly, likely, let's say even. Life will end for all of us eventually as we know it, eventually in some other form, in whatever form. The question is this, it's not whether life will end, it's how do we want to live while we're still alive? Do we want to live in fear? Or do we want to live in some other state? And that's a key question to make a decision about. So it's not that all the risks of life suddenly disappear because we're more skilled. More skill actually reduces many risks, but there's always risks. What do we want to do in terms of whether we live in fear or not? And that's a decision to make, and then build in and bring in these skill sets around that decision. And not just that decision, but that decision is just part of the initial decision we made to live a developmentally oriented life, both for ourselves and in compassion and in helping others. So that overarching theme of a developmentally oriented life, built both with self-care and compassion for others, underneath that is a sub-goal of, fear is not going to serve us too well or serve others too well. So let me bring in these skill sets to reduce that substantially, and then move on in trying to both live well myself and healthy life myself, and in helping others do the same. So that becomes the overarching theme around this. And so as we look at the shoulds, the musts, and so on, those things are contributing to our anxiety and fear. As those come down on a practical level, given that those contribute dramatically to our fears come down as these cognitive distortions start coming down. And we identify, and why do they come down? We start identifying them as unrealistic. And so the question then becomes, what are we practicing? Are we practicing cognitive distortions and practicing being anxious? Or are we practicing something else? And if we're to ask, why am I getting so anxious so quickly? Or why am I getting so frustrated or angry so quickly? And I would my question following that question would be, well, how many times have you practiced being anxious or angry? Thousands. And so if we've practiced thousands of times, we've gotten good at it. So that's one quick answer to it. So now we have an opportunity to practice something else, even in the difficult situations like the current pandemic. And if we can do it now, we're going to have even more leverage after the pandemic to be able to practice in more mundane situations. So the question of what we practice becomes a key one. And here's a wonderful video that speaks to that.
The question to you today is, what do you practice every day? What do you practice? Because what you practice, you will get good at. What do you practice? You practice joy in your life. You practice peace in your life. You practice happiness in your life.
Can it go up a little bit higher? Volume?
Yeah, that's as high as it gets for me.
You will get very good at it.
Uh,
And you will get so good at it that you will find fault with everything. Even when there's no fault that a layman cannot see. You, being an expert, will see it. What do you practice? You practice anger. Because if you practice anger, you will get very good at it. And you will get so good at it that the most trivial you'll think. Trivial. Will make you angry. Like sitting in an airplane watching the seat across from you somehow looks better than the one you've been given. And that is so unfair of the airlines. What do you practice? Do you practice being worried? Because if you practice being worried, you will get very good at it. And you will get so good at it that everything will worry you, including the buffalo you don't have. So I propose, if this is true that it's a question of practice, then I propose you practice joy.
So wonderful video, wisdom from the mouth of babes, right? It's so it almost comes down to those, and again, I know it's preaching to the choir because the lifestyle many of you have chosen is that of practice and yoga, and the practices contained in that. And but it's again a useful reminder that things like anxiety, stress, anger, frustration are also being practiced. And so every time we experience some stress, we take a deep breath. Every time we identify stress and anxiety and we identify the cognitive distortion behind it, that shifts from one to the other. And so that becomes the practice. And so over time, you do this a few hundred times. And again, it sounds like a lot, a few hundred times, but if you think of any skill set, usually it takes a few hundred trials before you get fluent in something. It becomes a skill. If it's practiced once a week, a few hundred times takes years. If it's practiced 5 times a day, you do it in a month or two. And so the frequency of practice, using every opportunity to practice, becomes a key element for high frequency. And so as we move forward, some other good reminders, we all make mistakes, but a mistake repeated more than once is a decision. So how quickly is our learning curve on these skill sets? How much do we practice, and how quickly are we able to learn from experience? And a mistake, I'm putting in quotes, it's almost not even a mistake. You can almost replace the word mistake with experience. But as we encounter some setback or something we didn't really want to happen, how many times does it take before we bring in, as we try multiple other skills? And so that's part of that awareness as well. And so again, we talked about taking responsibility for our anxiety and so on, rather than finger pointing to the outside world. It's how, not so much what's happening in the outside world, it's how do I choose to respond to what's happening in the world. And so this is one example of an exercise in cognitive behavioral therapy called the thought record, where you identify the emotion in one column, anxiety in this case, What's the situation? Say coronavirus, sheltering, emotion, anxiety, automatic thought. I shouldn't have to do this, or if I go outside, I'll get really sick, or what are the cognitive distortions among those? Shoulds, all or nothing thinking, either I'm not sick or am sick versus probability of those. I could be mildly sick versus moderately sick. So it's even catching it doesn't mean it'll be a severe case, might be a mild case, and so on and so on. And so you identify those, then you look at the evidence for and against that automatic thought, and you generate a replacement thought, such as, if I go outside, I probably, if I'm careful, um, I'm adding to the likelihood of contracting it, but I may not. For example, going to the supermarket and getting food. But given every time I go outside, I'm adding probability, it's best not to go outside too much. Unless I'm going for a walk when I'm staying away from folks, then I'm not adding probably too much to the probability of me getting sick or others getting sick. And so that could be the replacement thoughts. And what you notice is as you identify the cognitive distortions for our automatic thoughts, as you start catching the automatic thoughts with mindfulness, and the emotional intelligence piece is seeing the connection between those thoughts to the anxiety. And then we proceed with the replacement thoughts, such as, okay, I'm probably going to be pretty safe staying at home. Staying at home has its challenges, but I'll probably learn more skills while I do that. That becomes a replacement thought. Suddenly you realize your anxiety has gone down quite a bit. So that's how we're controlling our levels of anxiety. And there's often lots of excuses of why we can't do something or why we're anxious or angry. But a wonderful quote I heard once is, what's the difference between a good excuse and a bad excuse? And one response is nothing. That the excuses of not being able to practice sometimes sound pretty good, but even if, like, for example, I don't have time to meditate. So if we feel that way, then let's do 5 minutes of meditation. It's hard to argue we don't have 5 minutes to do yoga or meditation, and especially in the current times where we actually now almost have an abundance of time as we're sheltered to do more of these practices. Another nice quote I like, looking for happiness is like searching for the glasses that are sitting on our nose. It's almost too simple. That happiness and goodwill and wellness, kind of, you take a deep breath as you realize it's right there. There's nothing that we need to happen to have these contentment and gratitude practices and so on. And so as we're doing some of these things, we can, in terms of going out to nature, taking walks, hikes, here's another fun video on that.
Do you find yourself longing for the apocalypse? I did. I was looking for a reason to live. Hi. Are you feeling tired, irritable, stressed out? Well, you might consider nature.
From the people that brought you Getting Outside comes prescription strength nature, non-harmful medication shown to relieve the crippling symptoms of modern life.
Nature's recommended for humans of all ages, and it's great for pets too.
Nature can reduce cynicism, meaninglessness, anal retentiveness, and murderous rage. In clinical studies, nature is proven to decrease work-induced catatonia.
Caution. Nature may cause you to slow down, quit your job, or seriously consider what the you're doing with your life.
If you are overly cynical, jaded, or emotionally numb, you may need to increase your dose of nature. Do you have trouble being even mildly uncomfortable? Nature may not be right for you. Side effects may include spontaneous euphoria, taking yourself less seriously, and being in a good mood for no apparent reason.
So ask your doctor if nature is right for you.
All right, so that's amusing too, right? So the only difference between that video and the current reality is that sometimes you'd be walking a little bit more distant from some folks, but going out to taking walks in nature and hiking and so on is certainly doable, even in these times, right? That there's places where we can still do that when we're not coming in contact much with other folks. And so here's a nice quote I like: some people feel the rain, others just get wet. And so it's a real good, useful reminder in our current times, rather than just get stressed or anxious about whether it's a coronavirus or anything else, using it as just a tremendous opportunity to practice. And that's what we can certainly do. And some other useful reminders: just when the caterpillar thought the world was over, it became a butterfly. There are always things on the other side of challenges, always new skills and new awarenesses. Someone famously said, "Is wisdom is what we get when we don't get what we want." And so there's a reason for that, right? That a lot of times these awarenesses and the skills and the motivation to practice sometimes don't quite pass threshold, don't quite get there until we're forced to do it. It's like getting to know our family and friends sometimes right now, particularly family members that, or roommates we're with, when we're together 24/7 now for several months. We're going to get to know them better than we ever did in the past, under very under more stressful circumstances and so on. So for better or for worse, we're going to do that, and then that's going to present opportunities for transitioning and evolving relationships even faster than they would have otherwise. So, and again, sometimes for better, sometimes less so, but it does create these opportunities. And knowing that we're stronger than we think. You don't know how strong you are until being strong is the only choice you have. So we don't know what it's like to sometimes use these opportunities to practice until you don't have any choice. You're literally stuck together in a room or under the same roof, and now what? So even the frame stuck together feels it's a kind of a prison metaphor rather than a practice metaphor. So all of us can actually consider our homes retreats at this point, and use our homes, on the one hand, rather than being stuck there, choosing to view it as, I have this opportunity to be in this retreat now for weeks or months, and what do I want to do with that opportunity? So these are skill sets that I can practice while I'm doing that. So what constitutes emotional intelligence in part is, again, the awareness of what am I feeling: anxiety, stress, frustration, irritation. What is the other person feeling? Can I regulate my emotions? Some other skills of emotional intelligence include being adaptable, interpersonal relationships, stress management. And so even though we don't have as much time to go through these, I can recommend some books on emotional intelligence. If you do searches online, ordering Amazon's pretty busy these days. So ordering some books either online or audiobooks and things like that around these skill sets, around it, just even the word emotional intelligence can help, and some of these other things we've done. Some other titles I can recommend: Mind Over Mood is a good one, going over the cognitive distortions and all the work around that. A book by David Burns, Feeling Good, also goes over cognitive behavioral approaches, the cognitive distortions. And then some mindfulness books. I'm a fan of John Kabat-Zinn, has a few of them, others have too. But notion of optimism, for example, is one of the notions that we can practice. Practice optimism that things will improve. The pendulum always swings in the other direction. And so that's always been the case in history, in all wars, in all conflicts. So staying optimistic. At the same time, we can be realistic of what's needed and still advocate for what's needed now. But at the same time, stay optimistic that things will improve. And so not losing hope is part of it. And that also becomes a practice. Flexibility. How quickly do we adapt to these things? So first, reality testing. So I still have 1 or 2 clients that want to meet in person. And I keep reminding them, look, this thing is actually it's not getting much better, and it's going to get worse before it gets better, likely. The reality is that the experts are informing us of that. There's still optimism that a few months from now it will calm down. But for now, it's realistic to flatten the curve, so to not meet in person. So reality is part of it. And what can we do in terms of practicing flexibility around all of this? So to adapt to this reality, and to not just adapt in terms of surviving, but thriving. So not only kind of white knuckling and trying to get through it, but actually embracing it as an opportunity and thriving during the experience. And on the other side of it, a few months from now, we could be coming out of this with tremendous skills that we've been compelled to practice during the experience. rather than just dwelling on anxiety and frustration during the experience. And so again, this wonderful quote, there's no such thing as a problem, only a pause between ideas. So whenever you experience some frustration, not quite how to do something or how to get through something, keep going back to the skill sets: mindfulness, emotional intelligence, empathy for the other person, self-care, and just finding balance in those practices and doing yoga and other things. The other piece, just in the last couple of minutes, we're perceiving the world in certain ways. Again, going back to that reality, it's not the world itself, it's we're perceiving it. And the famous Rorschach test, as you see in front of you, and in visual illusions, they give us these wonderful examples that what we see in the world may not necessarily be what the world is like. And we have some choices in what we're seeing. Is it two elders looking at each other here? Or is it someone playing the guitar there? Or is it a gold chalice in the middle? And you see there's different things we could be seeing in these pictures. This beautiful one, is a tree and birds, or is it a profile of a woman? We see these two squares, A and B. When you put a bridge between them, you notice they're actually the same color. Take the bridge out and they look different colors. And so we start questioning our perceptions. And this is good for frustration and irritation, because that also feeds into our anxiety. If we start questioning, my assumptions and my perceptions right now are tentative and subjective. If I do this, suddenly I see something else. This is a famous dress. About 20% of people see gold and white. The others see blue and black. And if you're curious, so that's the notion of some of these notions of subjective perception are powerful. It's a reminder that others are seeing it differently. And again, doing our mindfulness practice, here's a fun idea that as we become more aware of these things, we do start noticing more aspects of ourselves. So this notion of being in the same place, there is a reality to embracing this as a retreat, being in the same place for a while, becoming increasingly more aware of ourselves as we do that. And so I'm kind of breezing through some of these things. Here's some other illusions. If you look at that, it looks like a profile. Let's take the mirror image. Let's do a 90-degree rotation, and suddenly a word appears that we didn't really see here or here, but we do see when we rotate it 90 degrees. And so what are some other examples of things that we don't necessarily see, and yet in 5 or 10 years we will see? And in doing that, it's useful to also recognize that in the last 5 or 10 years, our perception has changed over time. So how we see things now, what stressed us out and things that gave us anxiety 5 years ago, no longer give us, many of those things no longer give us anxiety now. And there's every reason to think that will continue in the foreseeable future. So that's something to also keep in mind. And the other piece of humility, other than noticing that our perception is subjective and tentative, changes over time, is noticing everything changes over time. Here's Rome back then and Rome now, then and now, and so on. And there's other exercises. Even where we all are as a species, this also gives us some perspective. If you condense the whole history of the universe into one cosmic year, this is a useful humility exercise, and see where we are along that cosmic year, what happened, which month and date certain things happen. If the Big Bang happened on January 1st, and we're now at the stroke of midnight, December 31st, like for example, when did human beings appear? And sometimes people guess May or June. And so let's look at this. A galaxy didn't even appear till May. The Earth appeared September 14th, first fossils, invention of sexual reproduction, first cells, worms, insects, mammals. The dinosaurs come around December 27th, they go extinct December 28th. They last for one day on the cosmic calendar. And so we notice we came around December 31st, 10:30 p.m. A whole species is an hour and a half old on a cosmic year. And then if you look at the first tools from caveman to present, 11 p.m., cave paintings, 11:59. So all of recorded civilization from cave paintings to present, 1 minute, and all of the invention of the alphabet and the so-called civilized world, 10 seconds. So all of recorded human history. And So that gives us pause, right? 11:59, 53 seconds, the Trojan War, the birth of the Buddha, Euclidean geometry, 56 seconds, Crusades, all the history of science, 11:59, 59 seconds. So all that is to say that we've come along, we tend to think that the current reality is much grander than it is. And so just a quick reminder that in a realistic way, that we're a small piece of a very big picture. And so while we're at the same time want to do our best and be prudent and make good decisions and self-care and help take care of others, flatten the curve on the transmission of coronavirus by sheltering, using those opportunities to do the best we can, all of it all together is still a small part of a big picture. And so we remind ourselves of all of that. And so that's, sorry, there's a good, and here we are, what that does for time, this does for space. And here we are, this little red dot in a Milky Way galaxy, and just going from one side of the galaxy to the other, at the speed of light, fastest speed that we know of, at that speed, we go around the Earth 25 times in a second. To go just from one side of this galaxy to the other takes 100,000 years. So at the speed of going around the Earth 25 times in a second, at that speed, it would take 100,000 years to go from one side of the galaxy to the other. And so just to give you a sense of the magnitude of space, and this is one galaxy out of trillions of galaxies. There's about 100 billion stars in this galaxy. Our sun is just one of them. So there's, and on this one piece of grain of sand in space, we're only 1 hour out of a cosmic year. And so again, that gives us some genuine humility around not taking ourselves and our own individual self and our own ego and so on too seriously. And at the same time, in parallel to that, since locally we do the best we can with what we have, we still try to maximize our lives and those of others, and try to embrace peaceful practices. Here's a fun compassion slide for my chicken. I dream of a world where chickens can cross the road without having their motives questioned. And so there's a lot we can talk about. And here's a fun one that needs no explanation. And we'll finish with this 1 minute slide that for a while, my students and I, instead of saying hi to each other when we met, we said the word boom diada. And because it captured so much of life because of the 60-second video. And we'll watch that and then I'll open it up to questions. Let's watch this together.
Never gets old, huh? Nope. It kind of makes you want to break into song. Yep. I love the mountains. I love the clear blue skies. I love big bridges. I love when great whites fly. I love the whole world and all its sights and sounds. Boom diada, boom diada, boom diada, boom diada.
I love the ocean.
I love real dirty things. I love to go fast.
I love Egyptian kings.
I love the whole world and all its craziness. Boom diada, boom diada, boom diada. I love tornadoes. I love arachnids. I love magma. I love the giant squids. I love the whole world. It's such a brilliant place. Boom diada, boom diada, boom diada, boom diada.
All right, so that gives us a nice indicator that the current situation we're in, just like the boom diada video, right? It's not independent of life and something to go back to later. It's an integral part of life, just like everything else. Life is just unfolding, and this is just the next unfolding. And so to embrace it rather than avoid it or try to suppress it or try to get past it, it's just the next thing that's coming. Let's embrace it, use it as opportunities to practice these skill sets. When there's anxiety is part of it, or frustration or anger, taking deep breath and meditation and yoga and identifying our own cognitive distortions around that and balancing our self-care with care and compassion for others. Those are all the opportunities as the stuff is now here. And so however many months it's here, we'll use those months to practice that. And when it ends, and there's an optimism practice to know that it likely will in a few months, then we apply some of those skills and keep practicing as the next stage unfolds. And so we keep doing that. All right, so it's a useful place to stop. Appreciate your attention and attendance to this. And maybe we can open this up for a few minutes of questions, maybe 10 minutes or so. So I think if you can type in questions, either in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and I'll be happy to address any questions you guys have.
Or the other option is you can raise your hand and then we can bring you so we can see you and then you can ask your question live.
Yes.
Okay, we have one hand up, Lalita. So I'm gonna move you over to allow you to talk. Can you turn on your video and unmute yourself?
I'm not sure how to turn on my videos.
We can hear you now.
I see. Oh, is that good?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. So my question
Yes,
is, I am a very pitta person, and I'm usually very busy. And when this started, I had the opportunity to close 2 of my businesses and lay off 12 of my employees. But what happened to me is that after I took care of all the business, I went into freeze, and I just couldn't seem to move or do or make it through a yoga class at home or sit more than a minute of meditation. But I guess that even just the reason I'm bringing it up is just today, just this morning, well, I've been listening to Swami Sita, and she said little by little. So I tried to do a little more by a little more. And just this morning, I had that realization that if I were actually being paid to take 2 months off work, would I be in this mood? And the answer is no. I'd be.
Okay, we lost your sound, Lalita. But I think we got the gist of your question. So maybe Shani can answer.
We do have fight.
Oh.
We do have fright, and we also, some of us, go straight into freeze.
Yeah, so I would say first, it's a great awareness that to note that if we were to get paid for it, if circumstances, our personal circumstances were a little different from that, then we might react to it differently, because that's already empowering, that it gives us the awareness, it gives us the ability to note that we can react to it differently. So we don't necessarily have to wait for the circumstances to change to decide to react to it differently. The question is, how do we want to react to it? So, and that becomes a non-trivial question, but at the very least, even in contemplating that question, implicit in that is the awareness that we can. And that's already a powerful shift, because a lot of times some of the initial inclination and the compelling illusion here is to just see it as purely unfair in life and to interpret it as that, to get reactive to so there's kind of a shoulds and all or nothing to that, to be mostly self-focused about what am I not getting versus what are some other things that are happening in the world, and compassion to others as well. And again, not ignoring the self, but not putting that fill up our whole screen. And so these are the things we can contemplate as we're asking this question: what would the situation be like? How would I react to it under different circumstances? And that's a powerful awareness that that's the case. And I agree with you that if the self felt more safe, it likely would react in different ways than when it feels threatened. And when our limbic system, our emotional center, gets hijacked by perceived threats, it's hard to not feel threatened. It's hard to feel safe. But the reality of the situation is, in most cases, even if we're in the midst of a loss, we notice that even with losses, those eventually change over time, and we regain, if nothing else, we regain skills. And it's also worth noting that in terms of financially, and I've had several significant financial losses in my life where I started from scratch again. So I'm not talking about this just hypothetically. Even in the midst of those, I tried to remind myself that the awareness that happiness and well-being have very little to do with financial accounts. And as long as we have food on the table and a roof over our head, and again, that if we don't have that, then it's well-being is highly challenged. And even then it's possible to practice it, but it's much more challenging to do so, granted. But once that threshold is passed, we pass the kind of extreme poverty where we do have a roof over our head, food on the table, then there's the correlation between money and happiness is not just low, it's zero. And so, and that this has been done hundreds of studies. People who make 30,000 or 40,000 a year versus 40 million a year makes absolutely no prediction of their happiness and well-being. And so whatever our financial losses, it's worth noting that data is significant. And so what that tells us is that I already know that it's not the financial losses themselves that are going to cause hardship, even though some of it may be challenging and unexpected and even disappointing. But part of the disappointment is our expectations of what I'll be doing in life and whether something will derail that, or whether there'll be a new direction. And will that new direction work well, even better than the old direction possibly, and so on and so on. So we're bringing these perspectives to the table and what we do with it. So if we say, yes, that's challenging, it kind of sucks that I have to deal with this challenge on the one hand. On the other hand, if the challenge is already here, I'm sure as heck gonna, suck out of it every ounce of wisdom I can get from this, and potentially consider the possibility that on the other side of this is not just more wisdom, but potentially life decisions and situations that would actually be even more fruitful than I anticipated, than even the original direction. And that's a powerful thing too. And by the way, in large part because we're bringing more wisdom to it. It'll likely be an even more interesting next stage of life. So to consider that, and that engenders optimism, that there's something realistic about. So maybe I'll just pause on that and see if there are other questions.
So Carl had his hand up. I just made him a panelist so we can hear him.
Okay. Hi, Carl.
Hi there. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom here. My question was provoked around that slide you had shared around a mistake done twice is a decision, which is really provocative. And to make it relevant during this period of time, there were times I was catching myself touching my face. And I definitely did make a decision, like, I don't want to touch my face, but there is something deeper in my brain, which I guess I agree that it's okay. This is just something that I do. Maybe if you could talk about the inner workings of the brain when you make a decision, but maybe there's like an auto response and what needs to catch up with what?
Yeah, thank you for that. So first, let me acknowledge that slide was provocative. And it was my rebellious nature in part to be a little provocative on some slides. So I openly acknowledge that. So second, it's a little, and part of it, and I'm touching my face now as I'm talking, but part of it is that it may not be realistic, that one trial is enough for learning, and often it's not. And so, but the provocativeness of it is to challenge all of us to reduce the number of trials we need to learn and implement skill sets. And it doesn't need to be decades or even years. We can do this stuff in weeks and months. And to think it'll happen in hours and days is probably unrealistic, or even one trial or two. But if we practice literally, several times a day, every day, within weeks we see changes, within months we see some long-term changes that become automatized. So that's the gist behind it. So touching our face, when we shift, and it's worth noting something else you said that was very realistic, is that just because we cognitively change our opinion about something and say, okay, I see why that's more realistic now based on evidence, I have my replacement thought and so on, that doesn't mean the behavior or the physiology is going to change overnight, because those are very different systems than the cognitive system. So for example, classically conditioned responses, if they've been classically conditioned for years, it's not just cognitive shifts that will lead to a change, it's behavioral practice that's going to lead to change. It's multiple exposures that eventually lead to a phobia coming down, for example, a fear coming down. So if I have a fear of heights and I say, well, it's mostly safe, and now I expose myself to heights, eventually my fear of heights will go down. The key word here is eventually. How many practice trials will it take? Likely a few hundred. How quickly can I do a few hundred practice trials while I do deep breathing and cognitively reframe? If I do 5 or 10 a day, I can do a few hundred in 2 weeks. If I do one a week, it could take me years. And so that's kind of, so the realism is that you're pointing to is it does have the multiple dimensions to practice on, they interact together. And the question is how frequently we do those practices will determine how quickly all this happens.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see, I'm seeing a couple of questions come in from Tena about being new to these practices. Should I try to breathe and implement some of these cognitive behavioral changes? Absolutely. So a lot of this can be done individually. And these books that I mentioned really guide you through the process. So you can do a lot yourself. Ultimately, if you see something creeping up that passes threshold to the point where it interferes with your functioning and everyday functioning, then that's a good time to consult with a counselor or a psychologist, a therapist. But short of that, a lot of times, a lot can be done individually by reading these really great books that are kind of the gold standards. And my suggestion is not just to believe me what the gold standards are, but you ask around multiple therapists, multiple practitioners, what do you consider the gold standards to be? And when you start seeing the names of books appearing multiple times, those are probably good books to start with. And so my contribution to that list is Mind Over Mood. Second one, again, Feeling Good by David Burns. That's a really good starter book for cognitive behavioral therapy. Those who are just beginning mindful meditation practice, I'm a big fan of Jon Kabat-Zinn. There's many others, but those are among the good books to start with. And there's other books on gratitude and some other things, but those are really good ones. So I would say that. So thank you for that question. Second question. Oh, I guess it's just an expression of gratitude. So thank you for that. Alavi is expressing gratitude on that. Seeing things from different perspectives, and I agree with you. I mean, I continue to see things in different perspectives as I keep talking about these things. And so it's, I'm right in there with you. And when things come up for me, I remind myself of exactly what I say to you. And to me, at this point, it's hard to ignore when I hear my own words that I've said 1,000 times. It's hard for me not to believe them because it's become so second nature. And that's really what it's about. It's like walking, it's like breathing. After a while, it just becomes part of who you are. And that's what we want to get that to. And that only comes with high frequency practice. But luckily, for better or for worse, life provides lots of opportunities to practice. And so the key is to embrace those. And again, rather than repress them or run away from them, or just invite them and use them to practice. And in the current age of this pandemic, it's it takes all these practices, takes it up a notch. And so it makes it a little harder to start some of these practices now, but that's okay. If not now, when, right? So that's that piece. Any last question on anything before? I know we're going over a little bit, but those are good questions, so I appreciate those. And thank you for those kind remarks also. Thank you for taking the time to do this practices. I know you guys are self-selecting yourself into this program and into this webinar, and thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
So the recording will be available if you want to share it with anyone, or if you know of anyone that missed it and they want to see it. You can find it on our Facebook or on our YouTube.
All right. Well, thank you, Swamis. Thank you for all your help in setting it up. I appreciate you doing all the work you're doing and messaging this out to the world.
Thank you, Shani. And is there a website that people can find more information about you?
Yeah, if you go to wisdomtherapy.com, so wisdomtherapy, one word, .com, I've got a lot of stuff on there, and also Wisdom Therapy Institute on Facebook. And on there, I have a lot more kind of fun materials, videos and quotes and things like that, that I think people will find both useful and entertaining. And also, when I do workshops around town, I usually post it on my at the top of my Facebook page in Wisdom Therapy Institute. So people feel free to contact me there, or to friend me on there, and we can stay in touch on that.
Very good, thank you. And we also just want to let everyone know that we started a free online stress relief service. So we're offering free 30-minute sessions. We have over 50 yoga teachers and therapists available. So you can go online to the Yoga Farm website on the front page and then find the link to sign up for that if you're interested. It's just a chance to connect with someone and talk about whatever stress you're feeling during the coronavirus situation. So that is there. And then we have more announcements about satsangs with Swami Sita. And then we'll see about some future things we can do with Dr. Shani and some other speakers we have coming up as well. So that would be great. Thank you very much, Shani.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great to be there. Great to share your time together, and looking forward to seeing each other in person before too long.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Be
Thank
well.
you.
Bye-bye.